The last 24 hours have seen intense Ukrainian attempts to capture the village of Rabotino in the southern front lines in Zaporozhye region, and a remorseless push by the Russians to prepare the ground for the capture of Kupiansk, a advance towards Kupiansk which has now been confirmed by a report in the Wall Street Journal. Let's first deal with the situation in Rabotino, which at the moment appears to be the only area on the entire offensive line where Ukraine continues to conduct serious offensive operations. It seems that over the last few hours, fighting both in the Bakhmut area and in the Vremivka salient area has died down. There's less word about any Ukrainian attacks near Pyatikhatki, close to the Dnieper River. There was a rather odd report from the Russian Defense Ministry that they destroyed what I understand is a Ukrainian inflatable a craft with perhaps 12 Ukrainian soldiers in it near Snake Island off the coast of Odessa. I'm not at all clear what that was all about. But anyway, the point is that most of the fighting, most of Ukraine's efforts over the last couple of hours has been focused on Rabotino. And from what I can understand, elements of several brigades of the Ukrainian armed forces have been engaged in this attack. Troops from the 82nd Airborne Brigade, the one with the Strikers, and the Marder infantry fighting vehicles. We've been seeing now, there are lots of pictures now of Strikers and Marders burning on the steppes, just as previously there were of Leopard 2s and Bradleys also burning on the steppes precisely in this area. Anyway, there's lots of pictures now of Strikers and Marders from this brigade, the 82nd Brigade, burning on the steppes. No signs so far, by the way, of the Challenger 2s. Maybe they've been held back in reserve, who's to say. And it seems that elements of the 42nd Mechanized Brigade, the one with the Leopard 2s and the Bradleys, have also been participating in this attack on Rabotino. And as I said, it has been a very intense attack. The Ukrainians have been making a very intense push to capture this village, which they have been unable to capture ever since they began their offensive on the 4th of June. And I've already speculated that the purpose of these attacks is to capture Rabotino by the 24th of August, Ukraine's Independence Day, to at least give Ukraine something to celebrate, some battlefield achievement to celebrate on that day. Now, I have to say that there is a certain amount of uncertainty, as there always is, when an encounter battle of this kind is taking place, about exactly what is happening in Rabotino. Yesterday, there were some reports that Rabotino had actually been captured by the Ukrainians, or that the Russian forces had entirely pulled out of Rabotino. This was then contradicted. Then there were reports this morning that the village is controlled 50-50 by the Ukrainians and the Russians. Then there was a further report which suggested that the Ukrainians now control around 2/3 of Rabotino, having penetrated to the center of Rabotino. And then there was a last report, the very final report that I've read, which is from our old friend Vladimir Rogov, who is one of the officials of the Russian-appointed Zaporozhye regional government. Anyway, Vladimir Rogov said there had been a Russian counterattack and that the Ukrainians had been pushed out of central Rabotino, that they still control some places to the north of Rabotino. Now, I just would say on the last that Rogov strikes me as being a fairly reliable source, but it's important to say again that he's a civilian administrator. He is not a military official. and though he's clearly reasonably well informed about what is going on the battlefronts, I don't think one should assume that his latest claims are fully and completely accurate. I have sense from Russian reports that the Russians overall are reconciled to the fact that at some point over the next few days, or indeed hours, Rabotino will finally, after protracted fighting, which has cost the Ukrainians enormous losses, fall under Ukrainian control. And it may be that on this I am wrong, but it does look to me as if that is the direction of events in this fighting for Rabotino that has been taking place, as I said, over the last few hours. Ukraine has made every possible effort that it can to capture this one village and thrown everything it can into the effort to capture this village. There's even reports of, in fact, film of Ukrainian helicopters flying very low, nap of the earth missions, as I believe they're called, to try to dodge the Russian air defense, to try to provide some degree of air support to the Ukrainian forces attacking Rabotino. But anyway, it looks to me as if the Ukrainians have pulled out all the stops, and I suspect that at some point the sheer momentum of this attack will mean that Rabotino will indeed fall fully, finally, under Ukrainian control. Let me repeat again my long-standing view that this is not going to change the overall situation. Rabotino was a village which I suspect Ukraine and its Western backers assumed that Ukraine would capture in the first week of the offensive back in June. It has been an appalling embarrassment and, frankly, something of a defeat, that getting to the point where we are, or appear to be now, where Ukraine might be finally close to capturing this village, has taken more than 2.5 months, and with so many heavy losses. And just to get a sense of where Rabotino is, to reiterate again, Rabotino is some distance to the north of the major Russian fortified lines, the so-called Surovikin line. Ukraine has never reached the Surovikin line up to this point in any part of the front lines, anywhere where it has been trying to advance. And in fact, my understanding is that it is within 6 kilometers of Orekhov. In other words, it is closer to Orekhov, an important town which has been the center of Ukrainian operations on the Zaporozhye front, than it is to the Surovikin line. So that gives one a sense of how difficult it has been for Ukraine to advance. They've been struggling for 2.5 months to capture a village just 6 kilometers from their main base, even as they seek to conduct an offensive where the eventual objective, the Sea of Azov, is around 100 kilometers away. So across many more dense fortified lines than those which existed around Rabotino. Now, there are claims that the densest Russian minefields are in the area of Rabotino. I wonder how people think they know that, because I don't know how dense the Russian fortified lines along the Russian minefields are, to be more precise. The densest Russian minefields are in the area north of Rabotino. I don't know how dense the minefields are south of Rabotino or along the fortified lines, but I'm going to make a guess that they are very dense indeed. And just to reiterate, over the period of the 2.5 months of the Ukrainian offensive, the Russians by numerous reports, have actually been working to harden those fortified lines even further. And I strongly suspect that part of that will have involved an effort to lay ever denser minefields in support of the various fortifications. So I think that this assumption that the minefields around Rabotino are the densest is no more than that. It is just an assumption, and we will find out anyway whether or not there's any weight to that assumption. But to be frank, I doubt that there is. I'm going to add something else at this point, which is that the battle for Rabotino in this area of control that the Russians established north of the Surovikin line has not only been an embarrassment, but to repeat a point which I've made in the past, it explains certain Russian forward advances in this area which took place in January. The Russians, as I remember, moved forces north from their positions towards Orekhov. There was a lot of speculation and rumor at the time, one actively promoted by some Russian officials, including, by the way, Vladimir Rogov, that the Russians were engaging in some kind of offensive or were preparing some kind of offensive in the area. I even remember reports circulating that the Russians were setting their sights on capturing the city of Zaporozhye, which is some distance to the north and is obviously the biggest city of Zaporozhye region, and which remains firmly under Ukrainian control. I think it's now clear that what the Russians were actually doing was that they were developing the belt of their defences north of the Surovikin line. Having built the Surovikin line, they were acquiring control of territory in places near and around the Rabotino, close to Orekhov, and they were using that territory to lay the minefields, which have caused the Ukrainians so much trouble. So it was not an offensive operation exactly, rather it was an operation to strengthen Russian defences. For the record, I remember Brian Beletic at the time making a video in which he said that he thought that that was precisely what the Russians were doing, and not for the first or last time in his assessments, he has proved to be exactly right. So I think that is what the Russians were doing. They were laying their minefields, preparing their forward defences ahead of the Surovikin line, operating a mobile defence, as Brian Beletic has explained in his very latest video, in this zone of control ahead of the Surovikin line, using it to wear down and draw the edge off the Ukrainian offensive. And I suspect succeeding far beyond their own expectations in doing that. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the Rabotino affair. It is a village. It is not a big town. It is admittedly closer to Tokmak. Its capture will bring the Ukrainians closer to Tokmak, much bigger, more important place under Russian control. But there are layers of Russian defences between Rabotino and Tokmak, almost certainly minefields as well. And we know that US military intelligence now doubts that Ukraine will be able to take Tokmak, capture Tokmak, before the autumn rains and the Rasputitsa close in. And that's, of course, disregarding the question of artillery depletion and all of those other things that I've discussed extensively in previous programs. Anyway, that's Rabotino. Much more serious, I suspect, in strict military terms, it's what's happening in the north. And as I said, we've now had a Wall Street Journal reporter. By the way, I suspect he's going to be the last reporter who's going to be allowed from the west, close to the front lines. The Ukrainians have become increasingly concerned about some of the increasingly pessimistic reports that Western reporters who've been reaching the battlefronts have been sending back to their media outlets in the West. I suspect this was a concern that extends all the way back to the fighting around Bakhmut when that got underway in the winter and spring of this year. And anyway, they've now they've now passed a decree which basically prohibits Western reporters from reporting from the front lines. And the French newspaper Le Temps has already spoken about this being done in order to basically conceal the scale of Ukrainian losses and the lack of progress that Ukraine is making on the battlefronts. But anyway, to come back, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal has been in the area of Kupiansk. He says that the Russians have methodically captured most of the high ground around Kupiansk, that they're pushing to capture more of the high ground to the southeast of Kupiansk, and he also confirms that Ukraine is no longer in control of the village of Sinkovka. Now, on that issue, it's not clear to me whether anybody actually does, in fact, control Sinkovka. There seems to be reports that the Ukrainians, perhaps encircled initially, but anyway, they've managed to pull their troops out of Sinkovka. That seems to be undisputed. It's not clear whether the Russians have yet moved in to occupy the village themselves. I suspect that before long they will. We'll see what the Russian Defense Ministry has to say about that. I would say that it is an interesting contrast. I mean, today, if you go to the British media at least, they are reporting to a fairly detailed extent the fighting around Rabotino, the fact that Ukrainian troops appear to have penetrated into the village, but they're saying almost nothing about the fighting around Kupiansk. They are not acknowledging that Ukraine has lost control of Sinkovka, which is, after all, a village, but it may be bigger or smaller than Rabotino. I don't know either way, but it is ultimately a village, just as Rabotino is. Ukraine capturing a village is important. Russia capturing a village presumably is not, even though the capture of Sinkovka, once it's confirmed, will bring the Russians much closer to the point where they can begin the storming, the capture of Kupiansk itself. Now, on this issue of Kupiansk, perhaps I ought to stress again that Kupiansk is divided in two parts by the Oskol River. There is the east bank and there is the west bank. And my understanding is that the east bank is mainly an industrial zone. There is some residential buildings there, obviously, but it's principally an industrial zone. The center of Kupiansk and the major residential areas of Kupiansk are located west of the Oskol River. And what is currently being threatened by the Russians is the industrial region to the east. For the moment, the Russians are showing no sign of trying to capture Kupiansk on the western bank of the Oskol. Having said which, the Oskol River is not a big, wide river. We're not talking about the Dnieper. We're talking about a river that's, well, it's certainly a lot more than a stream, but it is a relatively small river. I remember that during the Ukrainian offensive in this area in the autumn of last year, there were actually pictures of Ukrainian soldiers actually being able to wade across the Oskol in some places. So, we're not talking about an impenetrable barrier. It's clearly an obstacle if the Russians do want to continue to push west, but not an insuperable one. But one way or the other, it is Kupiansk east of the Oskol River that the Russians are presumably, for the moment, intending to capture. And I've already discussed how there's now reports of fighting somewhere on the eastern outskirts of Kupiansk. There was that really rather dramatic audio tape where one could clearly hear loud small arms fire. Apparently this was taken in the center of Kupiansk. Kupiansk not being, of course, a very big place. So it looks as if Russian soldiers are already operating very close to Kupiansk already. These are probably Russian reconnaissance units which have got involved in firefights with Ukrainian defenders. But anyway, it does look as if the Russians are steadily now closing in on Kupiansk, and it's likely that they will launch an operation. In fact, I'm guessing a certainty that they will launch an operation to capture the whole of eastern Kupiansk at some point within the next few days or perhaps week or so. That's my guess. I'm not saying this for certain, but it does look to me plausible that that is what is going to happen. And I discussed yesterday how there were reports that Ukraine is now rushing reinforcements to try to hold the line at Kupiansk, and how 2 brigades had been hurriedly redeployed towards Kupiansk from the Zaporozhye region. However, subsequently to that video that I made yesterday, there was a report from a Russian commentator that these 2 brigades were brigades that had suffered extremely heavy losses in the Ukrainian offensive. Supposedly, they were only about 20% strong each. The suggestion was, from this particular reporter, that the totality of the forces that these 2 brigades in combination would bring to the fight would be around 1,500 men, and only a relatively small number of armoured vehicles. So this is a scratch force, if this report is true, and not sufficient in order to turn the tide of the fighting in and around Kupiansk. So, again, this is a report, it's from a Russian source. I can't confirm its accuracy, but it seems to me entirely plausible that it is true. In which case, can I just say that it confirms an overall impression that I've been forming for some time, that Ukraine has been caught by surprise by this Russian offensive in the Kupiansk area, that Ukrainian defenses in and around Kupiansk are somewhat disorganized and weak in number, that the pressure on Kupiansk is increasing in consequence, but that Ukraine, for the moment, can't bring itself to basically end its offensive in the south and east, to redeploy sufficient forces to the north to contain this offensive, because doing so would compromise Ukraine's own offensive in the south. So it's possible, and this is just a guess, but it's possible, that if the Russians do push through, do eventually capture eastern Kupiansk, look as if they might be in a position to threaten western Kupiansk as well and to push across the Oskol River. It could be, on the assumption that the Ukrainians capture Rabotino, that they will call it a day in the south, announce some kind of victory, and then do what perhaps military logic suggests that they need to do, at least military logic as I understand it, which is go over to the defensive or perhaps assume more static positions in the south and east and redeploy what forces they still have to the north to contain this offensive that the Russians have been undertaking towards Kupiansk and beyond. Maybe that's what we'll see over the next few weeks, and maybe the urgency on Ukraine's part to capture Rabotino isn't just about achieving a victory before Independence Day on the 24th of August. Perhaps it's also about gaining a victory in order to make possible a redeployment of forces to the north to contain the gathering crisis that is developing there. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. There's been less news about Russian drone and missile attacks across Ukraine. Ukraine, for its part, has continued to launch drone attacks against various Russian positions, Russian cities and towns, including Moscow, over the last few days. As I said before, these drone attacks don't seem to be having very much success at the moment. Every so often a drone does get through, as happened recently when that Ukrainian drone hit the Tupolev 22M3 bomber on that Russian airbase. Incidentally, on that issue, I said that the pictures that I've seen of the bomber burning looked to me like they'd been taken from ground level, and it made me wonder whether perhaps some Ukrainian sabotage group or perhaps some Russian sympathizers with Ukraine, there are still some of these, might have been involved in that drone attack, or perhaps people from Belarus. I was very interested to see that the British Ministry of Defence appears to think the same thing. They suggested that the drones that Ukraine used to attack that particular airbase and that particular bomber did not have the 400-kilometer range they would need in order to reach that airbase from Ukrainian territory. And they too suspected that the drones were launched from close to the airbase by presumably saboteurs of some kind. And I suspect that that is the case. The Russians have worked that out. And as I said, there's probably a manhunt underway to try to round up these people. And no doubt if that does happen and any of them are caught, we will eventually find out about it. I would just say on this that if the attack was indeed carried out from close to the airbase, it probably explains why the Russian air defences near the airbase were unprepared. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the situation on the military fronts. A deteriorating situation near Kupiansk for Ukraine, a potentially critically serious situation for Ukraine near Kupiansk, and Ukraine perhaps close to capturing Rabotino, despite Vladimir Rogov's claim to the contrary. But in that case, even if they do capture Rabotino, hardly a victory that they can be proud of, given how long it has taken and what losses they've incurred in trying to capture this one village, and a victory anyway, which is not going to change the overall course of the war. So that's what I wanted to say about the military situation. Now, there's been more commentary about the general situation in Ukraine in the West. And here I need to make it one thing very clear. There have been now a whole string of powerful articles in the US media about the fact that the Ukrainian offensive isn't going well. There have been a whole succession of articles in the Washington Post, some articles in The Hill, some articles in Politico, a few in the New York Times, a couple of articles in the Wall Street Journal. The US media, in fairness to them, has covered the failure of Ukraine's offensive up to this point, actually, in my opinion, quite well. I mean, they're not, of course, concealing their sympathy or biases in favour of Ukraine, but overall, we've had extensive commentary and factual commentary about what's been happening in this offensive in the media in the United States. Now, in Europe, it is a somewhat different story. If we're talking about Britain, there's been nothing remotely like that. There are the odd articles that appear in a few places which concede that the offensive has not been going especially well. I've covered them. One finds them in places like the Daily Telegraph, which I suspect is, well, to be frank, I think it's pretty close to the British government, so it provides more information of that nature. The Guardian, which has been a fervid supporter of Ukraine, has basically ignored these reports about doubts about the Ukrainian offensive. Again, there's been one or two articles that come close to conceding that not everything is going well, but generally the spin of stories in The Guardian from a Ukrainian point of view remains supportive and optimistic. There's been one big article in the Financial Times, which has also and extensively reported about the fact that the Ukrainian offensive is not going well, but it has done so in a very interesting way, because the big story in that article was not about the failure of the offensive, but about the US media's reporting of the failure of the offensive, and the fact that this shows that there are growing tensions between the United States and Ukraine. Now, there have been some articles elsewhere in the European media. There was an important op-ed in El País, which is Spain's newspaper of record. It's actually historically been a pretty good newspaper, and perhaps less so nowadays, but anyway, it is has had a solid reputation as a newspaper. And by the way, I believe that it's read extensively, not just in Spain, but across the Spanish-speaking world, including in Latin America and elsewhere. Now, this is an interesting article, editorial, op-ed, because apparently it was written by a former CEO of the parent company of El País. And this article, this op-ed, not only spoke about the Ukrainian offensive not going well and Ukraine facing at best a stalemate situation, but it also lamented the extent that Spain and indeed the European Union had, through subordination to NATO, effectively subordinated themselves to US policy towards Russia, and it suggested that this was a very bad thing and that it was time for a rethink. There's an important op-ed in El País, but so far a relatively isolated such article in the US media. There have been some more articles which have spoken about the offensive not going particularly well in the German media, in Bild Zeitung, in Welt. But again, nothing remotely on the scale of what has appeared in the United States. And there's recently been some reporting in Italy. There's an interview with an Italian general who has Marco Bertolini, who is a former commander of the Joint Operations Command and the Folgore paratroop brigade. The latter, by the way, a famous, storied Italian military unit. It has a long history. I remember as a Greek that it participated in the Italian-Greek War of 1940-41, for example. So this is a, famous Italian formation. Anyway, he's published an interview with an Italian newspaper, Libero Quotidiano, and he said comments like this: from the military point of view, a victory of Ukraine is unimaginable. We should take this into account and sit at the negotiating table. In fact, Kiev's goals cannot be achieved in their expected form and within the expected time frame. The counteroffensive proceeds very slowly. Currently, even the West, he means really the United States, is becoming increasingly skeptical about Ukraine's military capabilities, and the picture is beginning to change. The fire efficiency of the Russians, especially their artillery, is overwhelming and looks particularly impressive in the context of the military aid provided to Ukraine by the West. Many circles, that's such a Mediterranean phrase, many circles have already realized the improbability of Ukraine reclaiming its territories controlled by Russia. Evidently, the Russians will not be satisfied with the perspective of Ukraine joining NATO just a few minutes, satisfied by a ceasefire with the perspective of Ukraine joining NATO just a few minutes later, and having the opportunity to resume military actions. The conflict can be resolved only through negotiations. So here we see an Italian general saying that the Malinowski plan, which isn't really a plan, as I said yesterday, it's really a threat. This proposal floated by Senator Malinowski, of the United States, that Ukraine go on fighting until July 2024, then declare a unilateral ceasefire, and the NATO then immediately grant admission to what is left of Ukraine, but with no guarantee that this extends to those parts of Ukraine which are still under Russian control. Well, I said yesterday in my program that that was a bluff, that the Russians would never accept that. And we see that this Italian general, General Bertolini, is saying the same thing. There's no conceivable way that the Russians will accept that. They will see it for the bluff that it is and instantly call it. And he's absolutely right. And that's what people should begin to grasp. Anyway, as I said, there's been less coverage of this in the European media, but at least General Bertolini's comment, his discussion, which I've just touched on, does acknowledge a reality which many people in the West up to this point have been ignoring, which is that if there's going to be a negotiated solution to this conflict, one that avoids a total debacle, then the Russians have to be involved and they have to be brought to an agreement. And the only way realistically in which that can be done is through a negotiation with the Russians which responds to the concerns that the Russians have always expressed. These include Ukraine and NATO. In other words, a commitment by the United States and NATO that Ukraine will not join NATO, a cast-iron commitment, one which the Russians can be satisfied will not be breached. Difficult to see how that can happen, but nonetheless, something of that nature. And perhaps some kind of negotiation that looks at the general security situation in Europe and begins to address Russian concerns over precisely that issue. Something which, up to this time, the United States has been deeply unwilling to do. But anyway, that is what General Bertolini appears to be hinting at. And the Chancellor, the Austrian Chancellor, has now made similar points. He says that there have to be negotiations with the Russians and that these negotiations must address the general security situation in Europe. It is impossible to reach a sustainable position on security in Europe without involving the Russians in some way. Now, what is very interesting about these sort of comments from some European officials is that we've now had a similar admission in an article which has appeared in the United States, where, as I said, the real debate has been taking place. The fact that all of these articles have been appearing in the United States shows that there is a debate within the US government underway about how to get out of the war. And to be clear, all of these articles that have appeared in the United States, in the US media, in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, Politico, Axios, Forbes, wherever, they all undoubtedly have their origin from within the United States government. In many cases, this is indisputably the case. They're based on briefings by our old friends, the anonymous officials. And of course, we've also had the case of the contents of this classified intelligence assessment that Ukraine is not going to be able to achieve its objectives. That's also been leaked to the media, and that must have been done with the agreement of senior officials within the administration itself. So there's clearly the debate taking place in the United States. A few European voices are joining in. Other Europeans are very reluctant to do so. I would say that some European leaders, the British especially, are probably very, very nervous about all of these discussions. From their point of view, a situation where the Russians and the Americans come to terms over the future of Europe, sacrificing Ukraine, as the British would see it, would be a political disaster. It would leave the British exposed and isolated. It would expose the irrelevance of Britain in European and global affairs. And of course, if the British found themselves being made the scapegoats for part of the failure in Ukraine, well, to say that that would be embarrassing for the British, well, that would be a huge understatement. But anyway, the British, as I said, are nervous about all of this, which is one reason why there's been very little coverage of any of these articles in the British media, apart from that one article in the Financial Times, which, for the record, is more an international newspaper than a British one, even though it's published in Britain. But anyway, we can see that some European voices are joining in. We see that people like General Bertolini, the person who wrote that editorial in El País, they're starting to join in the discussion. They are, in effect, suggesting, they're actually pushing for substantive negotiations rather than this impossible take it or leave it position, which is all that the United States seems to be prepared to do at the present time. And we've now had another article, as I said, in the American media, which takes the discussion further and which also says that the preferred US plan, freezing the conflict along the ceasefire lines, allowing Russia to retain control of the territories it occupies in Ukraine, but bundling the rest of Ukraine either straight into NATO or straight into some kind of security pact with the United States. Anyway, this article also casts doubt upon that whole proposition. Now, this article has appeared in the National Interest. Now, there are three big US foreign policy journals that have I wouldn't say exactly an official, but if you like, a sort of semi-official weight. One is Foreign Policy, the other is the similarly named Foreign Affairs, and the third is the National Interest. The National Interest is perhaps the least establishment-minded of the three. It's perhaps a little bit more of a more open access type of publication. For example, its website can be accessed without going through a paywall, which is, already marks it out as being for a wider audience than the very elite audiences that foreign policy and foreign affairs write for. And it's also fair to say that the National Interest has a somewhat wider range of commentators than Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs do. So it's perhaps got a little bit more room for manoeuvre, if you like, or allows for a little bit more debate than the other ones do, and perhaps it carries a little less weight than the other ones do. But against that, it's still, as I said, one of the big three, and perhaps the single most important article that has appeared in the US media, anywhere in the US media, over the last 3 years, the one which, as I've now come to understand, was the one that set the scene for the war in Ukraine, the one by Mr. Wes Mitchell, which appeared in August 2021. Well, that article appeared in the National Interest. That was the article in which Wes Mitchell was responding to an earlier article which had appeared on the website of the Atlantic Council, which spoke of the importance of splitting Russia away from China and suggested that the way to do that was to make concessions to the Russians in Europe, which meant, of course, concessions to the Russians over Ukraine. Wes Mitchell took the opposite view. He said that the right thing to do was obviously to split the Russians from the Chinese, but the way to do that was to engineer a defeat for Russia in Ukraine. That would lead to some kind of political transformation in Russia, which would bring about the subordination of Russian foreign policy to that of the United States. And he made comparisons with the way in which Bismarck was able, after defeating Austria, the Austrian Empire, in the Battle of Königgrätz, in the War of 1866, he was thereafter able to convert the Austrian Empire into, in effect, a satellite of the United States. He said that by defeating Russia in that kind of way, the United States would be able to achieve the same kind of hegemony, if you like, over Russia. Now, I have characterized or summarized Wes Mitchell's article in my own way. He might not perhaps say it exactly as I've said it, though if you go to that article today in the National Interest, it's still there, you will find, in my opinion, pretty much all the points that I've made. What I will say is that my own sense is that article has been edited and re-edited a number of times since I first read it back in August 2021, and I think that it has been significantly watered down since that point. But that, I want to stress, is my impression based on my memory of what it originally said. If you want to go back to my videos published in August 2021, you will no doubt find a discussion of it. Well, you will find a discussion of it there, and that will perhaps give you a closer picture of what it originally said. But anyway, fact that articles like that, of that kind of consequence, appear in the National Interest shows that even if it is the less heavyweight of the big three, it is nonetheless still pretty heavyweight. And so this article in the National Interest is one should take note of. And the latest one, and it is entitled "The Case for American-Led Peace in Ukraine." And it is by Alex Budilkov and Wesley Satterwhite. And we are told that Alex Budilkov is a researcher focusing on Russia and the post-Soviet space at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the Ljubljana University of Lüneburg. And he appears to have obtained his PhD on the maritime strategy of emerging powers from the University of Hamburg. So despite his Russian-sounding name, he appears to be a German researcher, but his co-author, Wesley Satterwhite, is, we're told, a US Department of State consultant and a military intelligence officer in the United US Army Reserves. And he holds a master's in security studies from Georgetown University, a bachelor's in diplomacy and international relations from Seton Hall University. And of course, Georgetown University is the key training ground for much of the diplomatic corps, one can call them diplomatic, but anyway, for much of the personnel that eventually end up in the State Department. So we're talking about two pretty heavyweight senior people. And the article is reasonably long, so I'm not going to read it all. And in many respects, it tells us many of the things which, if you've been listening to my programs, and you've been listening to our programs on the Duran, and you've been following commentaries by Colonel Douglas MacGregor, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, Scott Ritter, Brian Beletic, any number of other people. Well, if you've been following those commentaries, none of what this article says will come as a surprise. And basically, the article says that Ukraine has failed to break through in the offensive. The Ukrainians have sustained huge casualties without ever reaching the first line of fixed Russian defenses in strength. Russian forces fighting a textbook implementation of Soviet maneuver defense frequently enjoy air superiority and are augmented by increasing numbers of cheap and effective Western weapon systems, such as the Lancet drone. Every passing day draws closer to autumn and the dreaded Rasputitsa, the rain and mud season that impedes maneuver warfare. By all accounts, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is on the clock and unlikely to achieve its major objectives. Well, you've heard all of that on these programs. I'm not going to go over that again. All I will say is that it's now been pointed out that with Ukraine having suffered exceptionally heavy losses in tracked vehicles. It seems that it's principally relying now on wheeled vehicles like the Striker, and there's been some Russian commentaries which are saying that in the mud period, wheeled vehicles like the Striker are at a severe disadvantage. They will not be able to operate off the roads, and that, of course, puts Ukraine at an even greater disadvantage against the Russians, who have many more tracked vehicles, which are better able to operate in the mud than the Ukrainians will have. So anyway, we've had all of that. And then this article in the National Interest goes on to poo-poo the suggestion that any more military supplies will change the position. You say most of the pledged main battle tanks are already in the theatre and there is limited prospect for further deliveries. Reaching for antiques like the German Leopard 1, first introduced in 1965, won't be a game changer. The fighter jet coalition has pledged F-16s, but it's unclear when and where these will be deployed. We've done many programs about this. We've recently done one touching on this question on the Duran, myself and Alex Christoforou. The article goes on to say the F-16s would be outmatched against an increasingly active and confident Russian Air Force and Russia's formidable air defenses. And stocks of precision weapons are shrinking, which clearly plays a role in the administration's refusal to provide ATACMS missiles, vital for American security in the Pacific. And then the article gets straight to the point. It discusses the Korea scenario and the West German scenario, which I've discussed before, the idea of forcing a ceasefire or getting some kind of a ceasefire, either by agreement with the Russians or imposed unilaterally, and then trying to push the rest of Ukraine into some kind of security guarantee system, or even ultimately into NATO. And the article does exactly what General Bertolini has done. It says that this whole idea simply won't fly. And it puts it like this. The problem with the Korean scenario is that it assumes that the Russian leadership is desperate for a ceasefire and negotiations. There is scant evidence of this. Not only have the Russians fought the Ukrainians to a standstill in the south, but they launched their own offensive in the north, aimed at capturing the full extent of the Lugansk region, where Russian troops are steadily advancing. Russian society and the economy remain relatively stable, suggesting Prigozhin's mutiny was indeed an aberration. And his criticism of the war always was that it wasn't fought hard enough. And it goes on to say, in fact, the Kremlin might be eager for victory rather than desperate for negotiations. And then the article discusses the considerable build-up that the Russians are engaged in. And it goes on to say that the Russian leadership has repeatedly stated that the goals of the special military operation have not changed and will be achieved by military means. Moscow views the partition of Ukraine as a key objective, including Odessa, often referenced by Vladimir Putin, but also the rest of the Black Sea coast and potentially all the territory east of the Dnieper. Is it possible that the Kremlin is contemplating a second partial mobilization? And it suggests that it might be, and it suggests that even if the additional reservists are given a foreshortened training period, if they're called up in September, that will still allow an overwhelming preponderance of Russian forces against a massively depleted and exhausted Ukrainian military, which could secure for the Russians an overwhelming victory in 2024. And it goes on to say that the Russian dash to Kiev in 2022 largely failed due to an overemphasis on mechanized forces over the infantry. A Russian military that enters spring 2024 after 2 rounds of mobilization will no longer face this constraint. Achieving sufficient mass over an exhausted Ukrainian adversary means the possibility of breakthroughs and the return of maneuver warfare. If Russians can drive deep into Ukrainian territory and capture the regions Moscow has identified as its objectives, then the war ends in a significant Russian victory, and crucially one reached by force of arms alone, not a peace mediated by the United States. And then it says that such an outcome would be, well, it says a significant setback for the United States. In fact, it would be a disaster. And it goes on to say exactly that. It says the reputational damage to American competence and the NATO alliance would be colossal, as the best of NATO hardware and training has already gone into the Ukrainian military, and Russia would be able to make the claim that it stood alone against the West and won. The Sino-Russian relationship would also strengthen. And remember, going back to West Mitchell, the point of this whole war was to divide the Russians and the Chinese from each other. It would, on the contrary, strengthen their friendship and consolidate what is increasingly becoming a de facto alliance between these two countries, whilst at the same time giving this alliance the bounce that would have been achieved through the achievement of a military victory. And then it goes on to say, finally, the cheap and effective Russian weapons Russia uses to win the war, such as the Lancet, will flow to every regime and be imposed to American leadership around the world, which, by the way, is true. And then the article ends. Therefore, it is imperative that the idea of a peace settlement amenable to all parties in the conflict, including Russia, takes hold and is seriously pursued in Washington. Influential American figures are already engaged in track 1.5 diplomacy with their counterparts in Russia. Now, that, by the way, since it's appeared in the national interest, I take as confirmation that the report in the Moscow Times, that the Moscow Times is actually true, that there are indeed such talks taking place informally. As I said, they've not so far gone very far, because American ideas are of a kind that the Russians are not even interested in, putting aside even the huge issues of mistrust. And then the national interest article goes on to say these efforts should be encouraged, expanded, and form the basis for sustained engagement in peace negotiations. Unless one have any thought that these two people who've written this article are in any way doves, that they're in any way moderates, we then have the final sentence in this whole article, which gives the game away. Only then will the United States be able to focus entirely on containing China, which is of paramount importance to American security and prosperity. So there we are. It's not really about peace with Russia that these people are concerned about. It's avoiding the disaster of a debacle in Ukraine and also freeing the United States so that it can pursue its contest with its major peer adversary, which is China. Going back to that argument that took place shortly after the Biden administration took office, when there was the argument by the anonymous person who wrote the article in the Atlantic Council saying that it was important to make concessions to the Russians, to buy them off, and to try to pull them away from the Chinese in some way, which then led to the counter argument by Wes Mitchell in the National Interest that in fact we shouldn't make any concessions to the Russians at all. We should instead engineer their defeat and the collapse of their government and their subordination to the United States, also to split them away from the Chinese. You can see that the people who argue the position set out in that article in the Atlantic Council 2 years ago, that they're back, that they're the people who are driving the negotiation process, they're the people who are engaging in these, what they hope are track 1.5 talks in Moscow, and they're the people who are behind this latest article in the National Interest. There's been this struggle between these two streams going on now for 2 years. The president's own inclination, Joe Biden's inclination, was to go with the Wes Mitchell school. It's looking as if that's failed. The other side, the more realistic side, the ones that want to focus on China, they're back, they're making their arguments, and they're making their arguments with added force. They've grasped the fact that what people like Sullivan are proposing, these harebrained ideas of getting Ukraine into NATO at the expense of some of Ukraine's territory in the east, won't fly. The Russians won't accept it. And they're saying, we have to negotiate with the Russians. We have to negotiate with the Russians in earnest, because if we don't, Ukraine will eventually collapse, will face a military defeat. The consequences of that will be colossal. That's the word this article in the National Interest uses. And the result of that also will be this Chinese-Russian alliance, which we're so keen to split, will simply become stronger. Well, this is an argument that is underway. It's being fought out now every day in the American media. We can see that those who have been skeptical of this whole conflict probably from the outset are now becoming emboldened. That is why we're seeing all of these articles now appearing in the American media. The administration is deeply divided. It still hasn't decided which course to take. And I actually have doubts that the president himself, President Biden, ultimately has the ability to make the decisions that people like Burilkov and Satterwhite and the author of that article in the Atlantic Council and people like Samuel Charap, who wrote all those Rand Corporation reports, and probably the people in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of those people, I don't know that he has the ability or the desire to adopt their policies. But of course, as the election season comes in the United States, as his own position might start to become more brittle, as he faces criticism from the Republicans that he's overcommitted to Ukraine, as he faces perhaps pressure in the primaries from Robert Kennedy Jr., as he faces also legal pressures consequent upon the investigations of his son, as the various cases that have been brought against his leading opponent, Donald Trump, appear only to be strengthening Donald Trump, and as the economic pressures grow, perhaps eventually he might find himself in the same position that Lyndon Johnson did in 1968 during the Vietnam War, when it became clear that the conflict in Vietnam was not going as planned, and Lyndon Johnson was obliged to call off the American bombing offensive, Rolling Thunder, against North Vietnam, and to agree to peace talks with the North Vietnamese in Paris, and also to announce his withdrawal from the 1968 presidential race. So perhaps history is going to, well, not perhaps exactly repeat itself, but perhaps just possibly events will rhyme with all of those events from 1968, with another Robert Kennedy playing a crucial role. Anyway, that's where we are at the moment in the situation with the conflict in Ukraine. There's a number of things that I also want to touch on relatively briefly. The first is that this issue, an issue that dominated the Western media at the start of this year, was massively talked about last autumn, which was the price cap that the G7 tried to impose on Russian oil. An idea first floated by Janet Yellen, eventually adopted by the G7 and introduced in a barrage of publicity by the G7 at the end of last year and at the beginning of this, and about which virtually nothing anymore is said. And it's really quite fascinating to see how this whole thing has turned out. Now, the Russians have, in response to this price cap and the other sanctions, in particular the EU's various import bans, redirected a lot of their energy exports to the Far East. And they've established significant markets for their oil products in China and India and elsewhere in the Far East, including, by the way, Japan. And they managed to do that fairly successfully. And in some cases, amongst their Far Eastern buyers, they have been able for some time now to sell oil at above the price cap. Now, the price cap is $60 a barrel. And in July, the globally traded price for Urals crude, which used to be the flagship oil product produced by Russia's oil industry, the one which, like Brent crude, set the general price for Russian oil. Well, in July, the global price for Urals crude exceeded $60 a barrel, which is, of course, the level imposed by the price cap. Now, if the price cap was working, then at that point, Western shippers and Western insurers ought to have stopped trading in Urals crude. Except it turns out that they haven't. And there have been articles about this now in Bloomberg and in Business Insider, and it seems that Western tankers are continuing to load up with Russian oil and trade in Russian oil, even though the price is now significantly above the oil price cap. I believe it's around Urals crude is now trading at around $72, $73 a barrel. And there's been nothing said about this. The media, the general media in the West, has ignored this story. The contrast with the incredible amount of coverage they gave to the oil price cap at the start of this year is remarkable. But this time, despite the fact that the oil price cap is not working, they've said virtually nothing. One can find out about it by reading about things like this in Bloomberg and in other places like Business Insider, the kind of places which business people read and people in the oil industry read, oilprice.com and those sort of places. But one will not read about it in The Guardian, The Times, the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all of those places, which is very interesting. And it tells one what is actually going on, because the fact that Western shipping companies and presumably insurance groups are willing to continue to trade in Russian oil above the oil price cap can only mean that they're doing it with the knowledge and implicit consent of Western governments. Now, some months ago, Japan, as I remember, despite being a member of the G7 and a G7 member which had actually approved the price cap. Anyway, Japan actually said that they were actually going to opt out from the oil price cap, at least to some extent, because they needed to buy Russian oil. It didn't get a lot of publicity, but the Japanese were absolutely open and straightforward about it. And they were able to do it. The United States did not object. And, interestingly, now that a lot of the West's shipping and oil industry is now trading in Russian oil above the price cap, doesn't seem as if Western governments are doing much about that either. So why are they not objecting? Well, I think the answer is really very simple. The oil price cap has failed. It's become absolutely clear that the price of enforcing the oil price cap would be an oil shortage with higher overall oil prices overall. So, in light of this, Western governments worried about inflation and worried about the effect of inflation on their electorates have looked the other way as the oil price cap has crumbled. There is probably another factor, which is that Saudi Arabia, world's swing oil producer, the country which lies at the heart of OPEC and OPEC Plus, was, to put it mildly, deeply unhappy about the oil price cap. From their point of view, the oil price cap was unacceptable. It was Western consumers trying to set the price of oil, even if only a part of the oil price market, something which, as far as the Saudis are concerned, only they and OPEC are entitled to do. And the Saudis took various steps afterwards which reflected their displeasure. They moved closer with the Russians. They agreed OPEC plus cuts with the Russians. They accepted mediation from from China, and achieved a rapprochement with Iran. They announced that they were prepared to buy oil to sell oil to China and accept Chinese RMB, Chinese currency in return, and that they were prepared to do that generally in other oil trades as well. And they've shown a growing interest in joining BRICS. And I think that at some point the penny has dropped amongst Western leaders, especially in the United States, that trying to enforce the oil price cap, both for economic reasons and for geopolitical reasons, because of the damage that it is doing in relations with the Saudis, is impossible, and that the United States, therefore, and the West should quietly walk away from this whole project. And explaining that is embarrassing. One doesn't want to do that. So the result is that the word has gone out in some way that this is a topic that can be discussed in the business and financial press, but it shouldn't appear in the mainstream press. Let people go on thinking that the oil price cap is still in effect and basically let this whole unhappy story fade away. Anyway, that's how it seems to me. I would say that the fact that the Russians are now having little problem selling their oil above the oil price cap, and they're able to get Western businesses to engage with them in doing so, will probably mean that at some point Russia will start to obtain dollars and euros as well as RMB and rupees for their oil, and that will no doubt lead in time to a strengthening of the ruble, which has stabilized at between 93 and 94 rubles to the dollar following the interest price rises. I think that level of the ruble to the dollar is one which currently satisfies the Russian Finance Ministry and Central Bank. It enables them to strengthen the budget, the Russian budget, in the run-up to the autumn, when the Russians want the budget to go into surplus. So we see that it's played out well for them. Now, yesterday in my program, I said that I would touch on, and I'm going to do so now briefly, on the Luna 25 mission. It failed. I should say that, to my knowledge, Russian interplanetary missions for a very long time have been almost consistently unsuccessful. The Russians have found it very, very difficult to land launchers on the moon. They've been less successful than the Soviet Union was in the 1970s, when Soviet launchers landed on the moon and actually sent rovers on the moon, the Lunokhod rovers, and were able to return part of those landers to Earth with lunar samples. So the Russians have lost all those skills, and it has been undoubtedly an embarrassment for them. But I have to also say it is unsurprising, because what happened that even before the fall of the Soviet Union, it was clear to me that the Soviet space program was being drained of funds. In the 1990s, it sank into deep crisis. It's clear that a lot of the technical staff, a lot of the industrial processes were lost during that period. And the Russians themselves, when they decided that the time had come to revive their space program around in the late 2000s, I think they perhaps compounded some of their problems by perhaps over-investing in building an entirely new cosmodrome in the Far East, in Siberia, in the Vostochny cosmodrome, which has proved enormously expensive and which has attracted problems of mismanagement and corruption, rather than perhaps more conservatively focus on building up one of their existing cosmodromes within Russian territory, like Kapustin Yar. Anyway, I think that probably drained their space program even more of resources. The Russian space agency, Roscosmos, has a very unstable leadership. There's been a succession of directors. One of them, Dmitry Rogozin, skilled politician though he may be, hardly the kind of administrator that Roscosmos needed. So it is completely unsurprising that this space program has been in some disarray and for some time. Now, my own feeling is that despite the failure of Luna 25, the worst problems are now in the past. Vostochny is partly built and actually operating. Roscosmos has in Yuri Borisov a military technocrat with significant organizational and technical skills and experience of working with scientists, and he seems to me a much more stable leader than some of his predecessors. And I suspect that the funding finally is going to be provided. So I suspect that what the Russians will do is that they'll learn from this mistake, they'll refine their techniques, they'll incorporate the new technologies which have been developed since the 1970s, which is of course a difficult technological age. It's going to take time, but I suspect that is what is going to happen. Anyway, that is me for today. Tomorrow I will start looking at the BRICS summit. The Chinese are talking it up, so the South Africans. Putin, of course, is not attending, but there's a lot expected from the BRICS summit. I'll discuss it tomorrow, and I will also discuss the latest developments in Ukraine. But this is where I stop. More from me soon. Just to remind you, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget also to go to our shop, where you will find magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again, more from me soon, and have a very good day.